Hello and welcome back to the channel. So, last time I made an offhand comment on how barbarians can't cast spells while you're raging, and I double-checked that, and it turns out it's not actually true. If you look at what the rage trait actually restricts, it says you can't use actions with that concentrate trait unless they also have the rage trait. Now, most spells will have the concentrate trait, but that's not because of anything inherent to spellcasting. In fact, if we check the spell components page, we notice that verbal components are the only component of spells that actually give them the concentrate trait. Material, somatic, and focus components all give the spell manipulate trait, but none of them actually give them concentrate traits. So this got me thinking. Barbarians aren't exactly known for being masters of utility, and picking up a little bit of spellcasting here and there can be a good way to offset that if that's something you want to do. But if there are spells that don't have the verbal trait, so spells that only require material, somatic, or focus components, that are actually useful in combat and specifically useful while we are raging, that might be an interesting extra incentive for us to pick up the spellcasting archetype and actually do something with that on top of a barbarian class. So I did a little bit of search on Nethys, and I found out of 800 total spells, a little over 40 of them don't actually have the verbal component listed in their stat block. As a side note, there are technically 3 cantrips that don't have verbal components, but they're all utility out of combat stuff, so I'm not going to go over them in this video. Now I saw this, and obviously this looks pretty promising. 44 spells, well, not a ton of spells, but certainly a large amount to pick and choose from. But because we are primarily a barbarian, a lot of the spells that are normally going to be useful for a caster are going to be maybe not as useful or possibly even irrelevant for us. So, what do we actually want in our spell selection for this build? Well, first things first, we want as many of our spells to be on the same spell list as possible. This is pretty obvious because spellcasting archetypes already put us behind the curve in comparison to primary spellcasters, and if we have to dip into multiple, that just really lowers the efficacy of our build. And secondly, we really don't want spells that require us to succeed in an attack roll or for our enemies to fail a save. Now, it's not to say it's never going to happen, but we are a barbarian yet again. Our spellcasting attribute is likely going to be a third priority behind our strength and our constitution. And more importantly, our DC, our spell DC, for our spellcasting archetype is going to be significantly behind normal full spellcasters. What this means is that we want spells that just work, that just do the thing that they do without us having to make any sort of check. Now, the most obvious choice for this are buff spells, but I think while those are certainly useful, they aren't going to be the highlight of this video, since you can always just cast a spell and then rage if that's the cycle you want. I want to try and find spells that are useful for us to cast while we are raging, not ones that we pre-buff with before combat or at the start of combat, before we actually go in and do our thing. So, with all that being said, let's get into our spell options, starting at level 1 with Harm and Heal. Both of them are available to Divine casters, and Heal is additionally available to Primal casters. These two are pretty iconic spells that heal or harm a living or undead creature depending on which spell you choose to cast. Now, the thing to note in this case is that if we're raging, we'll only be able to cast the 1-action version of either, because the 2 and 3-action versions both have verbal components. This is not as problematic as it would be on a full caster, because since we're going to be in the thick of things, it's not as hard to touch an ally to heal them or touch an enemy to harm them. That being said, using these as offensive options isn't going to be the best bet since it does grant a save to your opponent, but using it as a one action to top yourself up after taking some damage is pretty relevant if we do end up going with a Divine or Primal caster. Next is Endure, available to Arcane and Occult casters, which for one action allows you to grant a touched creature 5 temp HP. Now the scaling on this is actually on average a little bit better than the scaling on Harm and Heal, but it only lasts for one round, so we much prefer to cast it in the thick of combat, which is actually perfect for our use case. Next we have Gravitational Pull, available to Arcane and Occult casters. This just pulls a creature 10 feet closer to us. It does grant a fort save, but for a class like the Barbarian who really wants to be up close and personal with enemies, if you can be confident that you'll land that Fortitude saving throw, this can be a pretty solid option for you. Next we have Jump, available to Arcane and Primal casters, and this just leaps us 30 feet through the air. Now 30 feet is actually farther than most ancestries unless you take the fleet general feat. So using this as just one action, move 30 feet, is a relevant use case for us. Next is Loose the Path, available to Occult and Primal casters. This is actually a reaction which impedes the movement of your enemies. Now this does require a save, but because it is a reaction, if you don't have a lot of other reactions going on, then this can just be a good spell to throw out as a way to use spell slots. Of course, since we're a spellcasting archetype, we don't necessarily have enough spell slots to throw around, but if you find yourself with more spell slots than you know what to do with somehow, this can be a good one just to throw out and see what happens and not really lose a ton of action economy for trying. Next up is the Uncommon Overselling Flourish, available to Arcane and Occult casters. Another reaction spell, so all the caveats of Loose the Path apply to this as well. And this one dazzles and possibly flat-foots a creature when they damage you. Now notably, this will dazzle a creature even on success, so the fact that your spell DC is significantly lower than one might want is not as big a deal in this case. And dazzling a creature until the start of your next turn is certainly not the best effect, but if they damaged you on the first action of their turn, this will apply to the rest of the attacks on their turn. Moving on to the level 2 spells, and we have the Uncommon Confetti Cloud, available to Arcane and Occult casters. This just creates a very small burst of concealment. And this one's not as relevant if you want a small burst of concealment. You can just carry smoke sticks, which basically do the same thing. So probably not that useful for us. Next up, Invisibility, available to Arcane and Occult casters, and makes you invisible. Pretty self-explanatory, but the interesting part about this is the level 2 version ends when you make a hostile action. Usually it's only good for sneaking around or setting up to combat, but since we'll be casting in combat, we might at some point want to make an attack and then cast invisibility ourselves to be invisible through the enemy's turn. I don't suppose that situation will come up very often, but if it does, it is something a little bit clever you can do with this spell. And finally, in level 2, we have Silence. Available to Divine and Occult casters, this silences a creature and eventually gives them a bubble of silence to move around in. And this one is more relegated to asking your cleric friend or your bard friend to cast it on you, rather than learning it yourself to cast in combat. Next up are the level 3 spells, starting with Hypnotic Pattern. This is a 10-foot burst which automatically dazzles creatures in the pattern with no saving throw. However, it is sustained for a minute, and as a martial character, Our action economy is usually going to be a lot tighter than spellcasters, who usually have a spare action to sustain spells if they want to. Because of that, Dronic Pattern, even though it does something automatically, is probably not going to be super useful for us. Next is Sculpt Sound, which is available to occult casters and alters the sound that a touched creature makes. Unfortunately, it requires a will save, and also, honestly, doesn't do that much even when the target fails, makes this a non-starter for us. And finally, at level 3, we have Shadow Projectile, an arcane occult spell which, as a reaction, allows you to basically double up on an ally's attack roll. The relevant part for us is that even on success, the opponent is flat-footed to the triggering attack, which for a ranged attacker is going to be much more relevant than for a melee attacker. Now, spending a reaction and a level 3 spell slot to do this is certainly not cheap, but if you don't have other uses for your action, this can be a nice way to do so. At 4th level spells we have Necrotic Radiation, available to Arcane, Divine, and Occult casters. This essentially infects an area with, well, necrotic radiation, dealing negative damage to anyone that ends their turn in the area. You can also try and target an object that someone is holding, and while they do get a save to avoid it, even on success the object is afflicted for a minute, which is plenty long enough for a battle to conclude. Notably, if you choose an area, creatures ending their turn in the area don't get a save to reduce the damage. They just take negative damage. So even if you don't want to risk that they might critically succeed their save if you target an object they're holding directly, you can just target the ground beneath their feet, and so long as you can keep them trapped there, which as a barbarian is probably not that difficult, they'll be taking this 2d6 negative damage with no escape. Next up is Spiritual Attunement, which gives your weapon aligned traits and gives you resistance to opposing aligned traits, depending on the outer sphere plane you choose. Now, even though this works without any spellcasting check, it's honestly a pretty minor effect, so probably not going to be that useful for us. Next are the level 5 spells, starting with Blessing of Defiance. Available to Divine and Primal casters, this grants you a +4 status bonus to the save of your choice for a round. Now, +4 is quite a bit. This is probably better relegated to the full casters that can cast the 3-action version, protecting all of your allies instead of just one person. Next is Drop Dead, available to Arcane and Divine casters, and as a reaction, when a creature is hit by an attack from an enemy, you can basically force them to play dead, dropping an illusionary corpse and turning them invisible. This is pretty comparable to the level 2 invisibility spell, only instead of costing 2 actions, it costs a reaction. So, depending on how much you value your action economy, which as a barbarian, your action economy is going to be pretty valuable, this may or may not be worth it for you. Next is Hallucination, available to Arcane and Occult casters, which causes a creature to, well, hallucinate. The problem is this involves a will save, and so it's pretty difficult to use this for our particular build. Next is Rip the Spirit, which deals a little bit of negative damage and can possibly drain a creature they fail their save. Again though, dependent on a save, so just like Hallucination, it's going to be a non-starter. And the last level 5 spell is Wall of Flesh, available to Divine, Occult, and Primal spells. This is a wall spell, except you can also choose arms, eyes, or mouths to get a little extra bonus when you cast it. Now, these are going to be based on your spellcasting ability, but since walls are just pretty good already on their own, that's not necessarily a deal breaker, and it's just a nice extra benefit on top of the spell. Next are the level 6 spells, starting with Scintillating Safeguard, available to Divine, Occult, and Primal casters. This, as a reaction, allows you to grant AoE resistance to up to 5 creatures. And now, this has all the same caveats as the previous reaction spells that we've looked at, But unlike them, this one works without a spellcasting check, meaning that it's going to be much more relevant for our use case. The other available level 6 spell is Vibrant Pattern, available to arcane and occult casters, which automatically dazzles creatures, and, if they fail a will save, also blinds them. The problem is, they're pretty unlikely to fail a will save because we're using a spellcasting archetype, and if we just want to dazzle people, we would have taken Hypnotic Pattern all the way back to level 3. The one level 7 spell is Time Beacon, available for arcane and occult casters. This lets us essentially spend one action to mitigate risk for the rest of the turn, allowing us to rewind time if something goes wrong. While certainly an interesting spell, I'm not sure if we as a barbarian are going to be taking too many catastrophically risky maneuvers that we want to rewind time onto, and as a level 7 spell, this is quite expensive for a little bit of risk avoidance. At level 8 we have Disappearance, available to arcane and occult casters, which is a souped-up invisibility, making you undetected to all senses, not just sight, which is much more relevant now that we're at high level because high-level monsters are much more likely to have other precise senses they can use to detect you with. And finally, Scintillating Pattern, available to arcane and occult casters, is yet another in the line of patterns which dazzle automatically and impose an extra effect on a will save. And just like all other patterns, probably not going to be that useful for our use case. So now, having gone through all the spells, let's talk about which ones I would choose if I were going to try and create this weird barbarian caster. For spellcasting ability, we probably want to lean towards wisdom or charisma, seeing as barbarians have more use for those on average than they do for intelligence. As for the tradition, we definitely want to go with either arcane or occult. Almost every spell I just went through is available to one of those two casters, and in fact only 3, Harm, Heal, and Blessing of Defiance, are not available to at least one of arcane or occult casters. Another thing to consider is spellcasting progression of spellcasting archetypes. Because we aren't a full caster, our spell progression is going to be significantly delayed. For first, second, and third level spells, we're delayed by 3 levels in comparison to a normal full caster, but from 4th level and beyond, we're delayed by a full 5 levels of when full casters would get the corresponding spell slot. Which means, realistically, we want to be choosing as many low-level spells as possible, and we don't want to be depending our entire build on getting Disappearance at 8th level, since that's going to be basically the end of the campaign. All that being said, I am probably going to go with Arcane Casters, because they get jump at level 1. Now, that's obviously a pretty minor difference, and you could just as easily go Occult. For this one, I'm going to choose Arcane. And because we want an arcane tradition and to cast with Wisdom or Charisma, our only choice for spellcasting archetype is going to be the Sorcerer, who is a Charisma caster that can choose whichever tradition they want to cast with. Yet another thing to consider is that if we want to cast spells with material components, we require a free hand. And since we're already restricting ourselves from verbal components, we really don't want to be adding a second component restriction to the mix. So, because of this, we really need to have a free hand available in combat. And that sort of lends itself well to creating an animal instinct barbarian whose anathema is using weapons while raging, meaning our hand are going to be inherently much freer than other barbarians might be. As for the spells I would definitely take with this, I've picked out 4 from the list: Endure, Jump, Necrotic Radiation, and Drop Dead. Endure is just 5 temp HP, and those are always going to be useful, and more importantly, this scales very well with higher level spell slots, meaning even if all we're doing with our archetype is just casting Endure on ourselves, that's honestly not a bad use of our actions. Jump is just a way for us to get a little bit more mobility, and especially at lower levels, and double especially if your GM likes to use terrain, having the ability to jump 30 feet in the air or 30 feet across a castle or any other such situations can be extremely useful, especially if we're trying to reach enemies that think that they're safe in an entrenched position. Narcotic radiation, assuming you can convince your GM to allow you to have it, is just a solid way to deal consistent negative damage in an AoE. And finally, drop dead, again, assuming your GM allows you to take it, and you can actually make it to 5th level spells as an archetype caster, is a nice way to give yourself free invisibility whenever you're hit, which as a barbarian is going to be extremely common. And finally, beforehand, I want to call out the use of scrolls and wands. As a barbarian, even though you're a spellcasting archetype, you still get full access to all scrolls and wands, and notably, they don't require you to be able to cast that level of spell to use them. So even if you only have 3rd level spell slots, you can still cast 5th or 6th level spells, which are actually going to be on level for your party and thus feasible for you to get. This is yet another reason in my mind to go Animal Instinct Barbarian, because with it, it's much easier to have a wand in one hand and still have the other one free for grappling or punching or casting material components than it would be with other barbarian instincts that are more likely to want to use a weapon. So that's all for this week, and even though I went through all this effort and put together kind of a sample build for this, I wouldn't necessarily recommend someone actually play this in game unless they were really dedicated to the gimmick. There are just better things you can be doing with archetypes as a barbarian than trying to shove spellcasting in there. However, as Paizo releases more and more books and thus more and more spells, it's possible that some non-verbal spell gets released, which actually a barbarian really wants to cast in combat, in which case this build becomes a lot more viable. So with all that being said, thank you very much for watching, and I hope you'll come back next time to see what I have on offer. But most importantly, I hope you have a lovely day.